Hi guys, welcome to Counterfire, and today we're going to be talking about why Tim Pool pisses me off. And this video has been long overdue, and I'm going to explain why in a few moments, and it's mostly because of friendships and relationships that I've had with other creators. Lauren Southern and I have been internet friends for quite a while, and the way that worked out was she was shooting a documentary. She asked if there was any former law enforcement officers that wanted to come help out. Somebody dropped that comment in my comment section. I said, what the heck? I used to watch Lauren Southern 2016 to 2018. She's making a documentary. Maybe I can be of service. And then we connected. We actually helped make Crossfire. I gave her some consultation on the product, and then it came out, and I actually liked it. There was probably about 33% of it that I didn't like, but I would say that the parts representing law enforcement were entirely accurate because I was largely responsible for them and coordinating interviews with those folks. So Lauren Southern and I have been internet friends for a bit, and also professional colleagues. We also worked on a different documentary about firearms, which was also pretty fun, and we went to Baltimore and rolled around. So Lauren Southern worked for Tenet along with Tim Pool, but not just that. Lauren Southern and Tim Pool have been professional associates for quite a while, where she was a repeat guest on their show, and so I didn't want to piss on Tim Pool's leg while not necessarily upsetting Lauren. I think Lauren is a big girl. She wouldn't be mad that I was upset or annoyed with one of her professional associates. It was more like, I don't want to ruffle feathers, right? I don't want to ruffle feathers with Lauren. I don't want to ruffle feathers with Tim. But the truth is, he's said plenty of things that have made me angry. Same thing with John Dutois. He's a very talented cameraman, a very talented musician, but he's a hardcore Christian, and I think he's a little bit schizophrenic sometimes, at least his tweets are, but overall, he's just a really talented and interesting and cool guy, and we've hung out and had pretty deep conversations, so he has worked for Tim as well, so I didn't want to piss on his leg while, I don't know, calling out his contract boss. I've also debated multiple people who have been on Tim's show who are both smaller and larger. Not only have Tim and Vosh been on Tim Pool's show, but also Rob Knorr and Andrew Wilson. And Andrew Wilson and I are, you know, I think we disagree on a lot of things, but we're professional peers. And then Rob Knorr and I would say we're the same size, if I'm not a little bit bigger in some respects. And overall, I think I equip myself quite well in debates with those folks. So the fact that I've been swimming in this circle, but never really invited on, never really bumped into, never really anything like that. I know it's like there are hundreds, if not thousands, of aspiring debate opponents and political commentators. And so I never took it personally, but I was kind of like, we are swimming in the same orbit often enough that we should bump into each other eventually, right? Well, screw it. We're just going to talk smack because, you know, holding your tongue is for prolonged periods is actually quite frustrating. One more mention before we move into the parts that are frustrating, but Phil Labonte is another co-host of Timcast that I spoke with, and we actually had a pretty friendly conversation about why he's voting Trump and why I'm voting effectively against Trump, and the philosophical undercurrent that led us to our conclusions. So overall, there's lots of reasons why I should bite my tongue, but I'm not going to. So let's talk about the things that actually frustrate me. Number one, Tim has said in the past that his Twitter is a rage bait, clickbait, but it's effectively the meme of, haha, the joke's on you, I was just pretending to be retarded. And some of the takes on there actually align with his podcast statements, and so they have to be sincere on some level. It can't all be rage bait and outrage marketing. Some of it has to be sincere, and some of the sincere takes are insanely stupid. Now, to give him a little bit of credit, my knowledge from Tim is that he cut his chops by being on the ground during Occupy Wall Street. I believe he was in Tahrir Square during the Arab Spring in Egypt, and I think he also went to Ukraine a few times. So on-the-ground reporting should actually sober you for what's going on in the world and make you a fairly experienced and nuanced person, but I don't experience any of that nuance in his content. As an example, he went to Scandinavia in order to talk about the no-go zones, the Muslim no-go zones, which, by the way, I'm sure they do exist, but the footage that he used in order to corroborate the fact that there were Muslim no-go zones was he went to a Muslim-majority neighborhood in the middle of the day, basically a shopping mall, and then he was escorted out by law enforcement who didn't really escort him out, and then he had this, like, I want to say, unless we can find something, he said that there was a gang of young men gathering garden implements to come kick the crap out of him, and I don't think any of the footage supports that narrative at all. And so are you being hyperbolic? Are you lying for effect? Are you pushing a narrative? What are you doing? And I have to say, once I catch someone who's willing to bend the truth in order to push a narrative, I pretty much instantaneously stop trusting that person. The only way, and I know some of you are probably thinking about some of the hyperbolic people that I deal with in the debate space, or some of the hyperbolic people that I've mentioned in other videos, but the way that I will often try to differentiate a straight up liar from someone who is maybe self-deluding or hyperbolic is people who are willing to back their perspectives. And I think, to Tim's credit, he does argue his perspectives pretty passionately on Timcast. I'm not like a huge fan of the show, so I don't watch it that often, but I have seen clips of him defending his position. So is he being hyperbolic and intentional about that? Or is he self-deluding to the point that he gets really, really, really dumb takes? But some of these takes are so bad that I just don't even know how you arrive at them. And I have to assume that it's like outrage bait or a lie. And so let's talk about some of those examples real quick. So number one, I think one of the most cringe ones is the 50 state landslide. And the narrative, as far as I understand from what I saw, was that Tim believed the media was lying about Trump's popularity in reference to the election, that there were actually quite a few things about the Trump presidency that had led to him being more popular than the media would ever say. Therefore, it's quite possible that Trump was either going to have a very strong showing against the media narrative, or he was just going to totally blow it out to a 50-state landslide. You could probably find that clip and hear him say 50-state landslide like a half a dozen times. But here's the thing, though. There are only 2 presidents in the history of the United States who have ever gotten 50 states. That's George Washington and James Monroe. And I would have to Google James Monroe in order to check his exact year, but that's like, what, the 18th and 19th century? So we haven't had a presidential candidate that popular in like 100 and some odd years? Predicting that Trump, as controversial as he is, and how polarized the nation is, that he was going to be 50 states is insane. Borderline stupid. And even to try to extend a little bit of credit, the next 2 most popular candidates are Nixon winning 49 states in 1972 and Reagan winning 40. So what possible evidence did you ever have that you thought Trump was so popular that not only was he going to win, but he was going to win by an extreme margin that would rival Reagan, Nixon, Washington, or Monroe? Like, I only have to assume that Ian Crossland like slipped something into his drink before the stream and he was high out of his mind on THC edibles. That's like the only thing that I can come up with besides just raw copium, weird, delusional thinking. I can't even fathom what would lead you to this perspective. Anyways, the next one that really frustrates me is his harping about the Civil War. Now, I understand that talking about negative things and talking about people, by the way, you know, there's this great quote that you're probably going to hear me say a whole bunch, which is that, what is it? Small minds talk about people, average minds talk about events, and great minds talk about ideas. Well, what we're going to try to do on this channel is we're going to try to take ideas and ideologies, and we're going to try to take events, and we're going to try to package them within people so we make it attractive for the people who enjoy interpersonal drama, but then we also talk about the higher level ideas. That way you can actually get a little bit of broccoli with your candied bacon, right? So the Civil War idea could be outrage and anger marketing, but it's so unfathomably stupid to anyone who has been involved in any amount of conflict whatsoever. So I served 4 years in law enforcement. I served 4 years in the Marine Corps. And I deployed to a civil war. It was the war in Iraq. It was the ethno-religious conflict between the Shia and the Sunni. And that was a civil war. What was happening was people along ethno-religious tribal lines were dragging each other out of their houses, executing them, and then throwing corpses of men, women, and children into ditches. They were kidnapping their political opponents and torturing them with power tools in basements and garages in order to intimidate the rival political factions. There were segments of the government that defected in order to take over different territories that were materially rich, because they knew that if they controlled those territories, then they would have further leverage against the government that they were rebelling against. That was a civil war. Tribal groups killing the heck out of each other. Having a bunch of LARPing weirdo nerds show up to random places in the United States, attempting to do a peaceful protest, but then getting into a street brawl is not a civil war. Having irreconcilable philosophical differences in a liberal democracy is not a civil war. Even having people murdered during riots is not a civil war. And you have to be such an ahistorical buffoon to think that this term, civil war, belongs next to the civil unrest that we're experiencing right now, that I have to assume that it's outrage marketing, or else if you sincerely believe it, then I have to assume that you're somewhat stupid. So we have had a culture war in the United States the entire time that we have existed. We have had political conflicts the entire time that we've existed. We've had tribalist political factions with irreconcilable philosophical differences the entire time that we have existed. And we were not in a civil war for the past 200 and some odd years, right? The Civil War was in 1865. That was over the secession of the southern states and over slavery. Do we count Reconstruction as a civil war? Do we count the Union busting of the early 20th century as civil war? Do we count the terrorism, the Weathermen Underground, the people who bombed places in the 1970s? Was that a civil war? No, absolutely not. It was tribalist political groups fighting over the fate of the country, and they did have irreconcilable differences between multiple tribal groups. That's what it means to be in a liberal democracy, is that rather than fighting it out with blades and swords and only having one tribe that's in charge that everybody has to conform to, you instead have people fighting it out through conversation and sometimes extrajudicial violence, but it is such a small degree compared to civil conflict that it's actually mind-boggling and infuriating that he says that with any level of sincerity whatsoever. Finally, I think that the silliest one, which is related to the recent Tenet revelations, where it was demonstrated that a Mr. Poole was receiving a healthy chunk of funding from Russian oligarchs who funneled their money through a series of shell corporations into Tenet, the media company, was his 2-minute passionate rant in which he slammed on the desk and he said that Ukraine is the #1 enemy of the United States. So his defense, after he received, it was revealed that he received hundreds of thousands of dollars from Russia, was that was his earnest dog shit opinion. Excuse my profanity, but I think it is just fitting. The opinion is so bad. It is the fecal matter that has, it is the rhetorical equivalent of fecal matter that has come out of a dog. And so I'm just thinking to myself, like, words don't mean anything anymore. And they don't mean anything to Tim, and they don't mean anything to Tim's audience if they take that as a sincere position. So what's happened is, to explain it briefly, we are a part of a global commercial empire. I think anybody who criticizes the United States could rightfully, descriptively say that's what it is. The United States backs the EU, they back NATO, they back unilateral alliances in Asia, they back multilateral alliances in Asia and in Africa and in Europe. And the whole point of it is to get as many countries as possible to unify under at least a commercial tie, so we don't go to war with each other and we can trade more without killing each other. And hopefully this materially benefits everyone. And Russia had its own sphere of influence previously and historically that we have chipped away at by taking Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Poland, now some of the Scandinavian states, and we've brought them into NATO and some of them into the EU. And so what's happened is our commercial hegemony has expanded into Russia's backyard, and they don't like it. And Ukraine, to them, was a red line where if we try to get into Ukraine via the EU or NATO, then they were going to take the Russian majority areas for themselves. That's what Russia decided to do. And Ukraine, a healthy chunk of Ukraine, wanted to become a part of the Western hegemonic liberal order. You can call it mixed economy capitalist, you can call it commercial, you can call it liberal, I don't care. Global hegemony, global homosexual, call it whatever you want. but a healthy chunk of those people wanted to become a part of that. And before you criticize me and say like, well, no, they don't, and they've already lost hundreds of thousands of people to this war, et cetera, the mere fact that they are still fighting tells me that a healthy chunk of those people do want to become a part of the Western world. They do want to be a part of the EU. They do want to have better ties with Europe. They do want to have ties with NATO. They do want to have ties with the United States. And the reason why is, I'll just tell you very, very bluntly, Afghanistan fell in like 11 days. Western Iraq was taken by ISIS within a matter of weeks, and it was just a series of dudes in white trucks with AK-47s. And the central government and the militias in eastern Iraq, or excuse me, in northwestern Iraq, they just rolled over and allowed themselves to be taken over. There was no will to fight. Ukrainians holding the defensive lines that they've been holding for years and fighting over every single bloody inch. And not only that, launching a counteroffensive into Kursk is obvious evidence that they want to continue to fight. Now you're like, Connor, we don't want to sacrifice hundreds of thousands of Russians and Ukrainians in a quote unquote forever war to the satisfaction of global capitalist elites. And I agree with you. There needs to be a negotiation between these parties. But what Ukraine is doing, because they launched an offensive in the southeast, and that offensive did not break any new ground, and they're actually losing territory in some locations, they took a unsecured territory from Russia, I believe it's called Kursk, and they're likely going to use that. I think Zelensky has said as much. They're going to use it as a bargaining chip in order to get concessions in Zaporozhye, which is the southern county that is still in dispute between Ukraine and Russia. So Donetsk is, majority ethnic Russian, right? And I know Ukrainians aren't going to like that I'm saying this, but I don't care. The truth hurts sometimes. You're probably not taking back Donetsk. You're probably not taking back Luhansk. You're probably not taking back Crimea. But if you have Kursk and it's Russian territory, historically Russian territory, then you can trade that for concessions in Zaporozhye. But what does Tim say about this complex geopolitical situation that involves geography, involves warfare, involves diplomacy, involves American global hegemony, involves the Ukrainian interest, involves the Russian interest? He says that Ukraine, a country that is trying to come our way with the global hegemony, is actually an enemy, meaning that they are an opposing military force that seeks our destruction. That is such a wildly stupid statement that I would need to get a thesis paper in order to write down all of the elements of how stupid it is. And yet tens of thousands of people take this as a serious and viable opinion to have on the World Wide Web. It's infuriating to no degree. And by the way, just to make it clear, I like John Dutoit. I like Lauren Southern. I like Phil Labonte. I like a healthy chunk of people that are in his orbit. But I feel like what's been happened, the person who is philosophically liberal, but he leans more right than he leans left, the person who thinks that the left has gone too far. I feel like my position has been taken by a lunatic moron who is just saying the wildest shit possible in order to get as much attention to himself as possible, in order to make as much money as possible, and he doesn't care who he hurts or kills as a result. Now, is Tim Pool driving American policy, or is it a bit of the tail wagging the dog scenario? Is he just reflecting back to MAGA what they probably already believe? No, MAGA's already isolationist, so he's probably just reflecting it back to them. But the fact that we have an electorate who can even be talked to in this way, in which one of the dumbest geopolitical analyses that I have ever heard in my entire life is uttered with zeal and sincerity, and it is rewarded with hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions, on an annual basis, it pisses me off. It pisses me off to no end, and frankly, I'm going to continue to upload daily, and if criticizing the people like Tim Pool, Lauren Chen, Jack Posobiec, etc., if we can take complex ideas and nest it in criticisms of individuals, that's exactly what we're going to do. Because I feel like the center or the center right has been claimed and is populated by either morons, liars, or propagandists, and I can't stand it anymore. I hate it. So yeah, that's why Tim Pool pisses me off. Appreciate your time and attention. I will catch you in the next one. I hope you have a fantastic day. Godspeed.